come out to in the entire world.
Live at Red Rocks, this place is obviously epic on a myriad of levels.
We in Colorado, baby. We in Denver.
We come to Denver and make genuine connections, new partners, new agents, new managers, excellent representation, and people you can work with for the rest of your career.
I think it's so important for creators to get together because that's the future of our business. And this community really proves that we're stronger together.
Welcome to the Chinwag podcast.
Well, it's always because an audience is nice. They feed you. The energy is nice. They have a back and forth with people. Then people got up and were telling us really interesting things about themselves, and it's great.
Everything good that has ever happened in my entire career has somehow, in one way, shape, or another, come from SeriesFest.
Do it again, okay? It's take two.
Take
Listen,
two.
let's do it. Yeah, let's do it right.
Richard asks me, what's showing tonight?
What's going on behind me? It's SeriesFest, baby. It's really a celebration of creators. That's really what we're here to do, is celebrate creators on the verge of breaking into the industry.
And everybody I've met is not only interested in you personally and what you do creatively, but they want to share their story.
It's really about the community, it's really about the arts, it's about the people who make the films and the television shows. The artists come first here.
And we're doing a panel today about Hollywood disabilities and how to open up more opportunities around that.
It's actually been a great time. I'm excited for the party tonight, too. I'm excited for all the parties.
All you filmmakers out there, if you have a series that you want to get exposure, SeriesFest is the place to do it.
It'll be bigger than the NFL in 3 years.
It's like going to the best summer camp you always wished existed when you were a kid.
Beautiful day today, sunny and green, so we'll see you season 10.
I am 2 thumbs up for season 10.
Thank you, everybody, for attending this screening this afternoon. My name is Steve Greene. I'm a member of the TV team at IndieWire. We have a fantastic conversation for you. 3 of the gentlemen instrumental in this project happening are here to speak with us about this. So why don't I bring up Zach, Dan, and Patrick, and then we'll have a conversation from there. Woo!
We'll let you drive.
This is a show about design, so this
the aesthetics matter.
We want to make sure that this is pleasing to the eye. I guess on that note, I always love a title with a double meaning, or that has a larger resonance beyond just sounding good. So why full bleed for people who may not know that is a design term?
So full bleed, in a basic sense in the design world, just means the edge of the frame, right? So pushing it all the way to the edge of the paper, whatever the format is. But then it also means in the other sense, this idea of kind of putting it all out there, laying it all on the line. And interestingly, I was thinking about when we came up with the title Full Bleed, and it was 5 years ago. We started working on this project 5 years ago, and as we were putting together some research to come to share the film, I realized like what a crazy journey it's been to get to this moment. And like in a lot of ways, the story of making this is in itself like a full bleed. Like there was a million reasons to stop, right, and not keep going. But that's, I guess, kind of where the title comes from.
This is a series about creativity, and for as big as you would imagine that sort of subgenre of documentary would be, there aren't as many projects about doing what this project is actually connecting to. And so given that you're not necessarily having to draft off of what people already know, what were some things that you wanted to avoid? Like what were some things that you didn't want this to be, I guess, beyond the sort of the baseline of the project?
I think one thing we didn't want it to be was abstract, which is a great show, but we wanted to make something different. I think we wanted to lead into the things that we care about at Adobe, which is like the creative process and our creative community and creativity in general. I think your point, like there's not a lot of content out there like this. It's kind of strange that there's not more stuff around those. There's a few things you can point to, but the opportunities here to tell stories of creativity, and especially complicated, hard, show how hard it is and how, the full bleedness of it, having to push through. It's more about what we did want to show than I think what we didn't want to show. I mean, there's a lot of things, Patrick brought so much to it that was great filmmaking and storytelling. So we wanted a creative, an artist, to tell the film, to tell the stories. So, but I don't think we were intentionally avoiding anything other than not being good.
Yeah. Yeah, we were all fans of abstract, and I think as much as we like that series and that kind of storytelling, those kind of profiles that are these look backs, I think the thing that we saw that was maybe the more interesting thing was what if you just drill in really deep into one project that one of these really high profile creators have made and try to unpack that process. And you realize pretty quickly that's actually where the drama is, right? That's where the story is. And so whether it's this one or there's a couple more that we made, digging into the journey, in this case, the 10-year journey of getting the thing made was really the thing that we were most excited about when we started putting it together.
I think what's really challenging about the process is you got sort of two different types of stories happening. One is the story of a creative process, which is universally relatable for anybody. Is it cutting in and out? Or is it just me? Yeah, you're done. The first thing is the story of the creative process, which I think is something that is pretty universal, and the lessons that come out of that, how to maintain your resilience against failure, how to leverage a failure into something that can be really generative for the project. And then there's this other sort of historical aspect, and I think what was challenging is to not take the historical events and use them in a sensational way, and not to sort of align those two narratives for maximum dramatic impact when that isn't really how it happened. There's a lot of ways that you could shape the story after the fact that would have really played up the melodrama. But I think, especially when you're dealing with tragic historical events, that kind of manipulation just starts to feel a little bit untrue and in the best case scenario, really. So I think that was a challenge, is how do you make a compelling narrative when your narrative, your creative process plot points don't align exactly with the plot of history,
Especially when the historical context here is something that everybody is bringing their own things to. You're not talking about an obscure historical example that people aren't aware of. You don't have the luxury of starting from a blank slate.
Exactly.
So for Patrick, you have a artistic background that goes beyond filmmaking and documentary. As somebody who is coming into this project that is about creation and design, the artistic process, what were some things that you sort of identified with this episode from up top as a way to get into it that wasn't just sort of your standard doc profile?
I'm really interested in any creative process, and I can spend hours just watching artists work in their studios, and I like to read about their sketchbooks. So that stuff's deeply fascinating to me. But I think that what's really interesting is when there's a metaphor to, let's just say, make that process very, very visual and very, very understandable to the audience. So in Daniel's case, the things that were really there for the taking were obviously his love of music and his background in music, and then the anecdote about, how this cursed kitchen table ruined his homework assignments when he was in architecture school, but then actually, really, if you've ever been to the museum, even down the street, you see that the imperfect, unparalleled lines are really something that became, a signature, something that he was able to own, really. So I think, I think anything where there's a creative process and you can explain that in a way that lands with as many people as possible, I think that a metaphor is the way to do it. A visual metaphor, especially one that you can sort of tee up. So we could take, his drawings and look at them like they were pieces of music that were being scored before our eyes. And I used to do a lot of music videos, and essentially a good music video is basically a concept or an analogy or a metaphor set to music. So it was kind of like, how do you ask an artist to explain their creative process, think about that as a song, and then make a music video for it in a way. And that's where a lot of the sort of animation ideas kind of came from.
One of the cooler things about the experience, especially with Daniel, is like working through the project with him forced him to really consider his process and like think about a lot of the things that impacted him as an architect. And so even just the thing about the dinner table, like that's something that he kind of stumbled into as we're developing it. And to be able to like draw that out of someone like him who's touched so many people with his work, it's like such a special experience. And it's something that I think we all like were inspired by as we kind of kept on the journey of trying to make this one and others. It's like that opportunity to like unlock something in these people.
Yeah, I think there's also, like what you want in a film is these moments where the audience can go, oh, like there's the sort of aha, and there's like 3 or 4 in here. There's the slurry wall, and there's the void, and there's the table, and there's all these moments where you can actually like share a revelation, and I think it really works here. And I think the other films do the same thing too.
I'm glad you brought up that we only screened this one episode, but this is part of a bigger series. What kind of conversations did the three of you have about making this feel true to Daniel and his work, but also fit into the bigger project that you had envisioned?
We quickly realized that there aren't that many world-changing events that have visual, creativity attached to them. So that's sort of an issue. But I think, to your point, every person who makes anything, will have key moments in their life that will influence the decisions that they make, and it's like the Rosebud moment in Citizen Kane, and everybody has those moments, and whether or not you redesign Ground Zero or you create something else or you do something that's purely you create a product, not even a work of art, there are moments in our history, I think, that influence the decisions we make and the directions we point ourselves in, and that it's a very, very broad statement, but one that I think is true and hopefully makes this a series that we can look at without having to have kind of world-changing events, because, as I mentioned, there aren't a whole ton of them.
Creatively, like one of the choices we made earlier on was to have each episode sort of visually be informed by the work and the process of the subject. So like the Daniel episode is very different from the other two. And they're very different from this one because they were kind of designed at the outset to reflect like the work and the spirit of the person. They still are, I guess, spiritually related. You can see there's a bit of DNA across all of them that's shared, but that was really important, that each one felt like it really reflected who the creator was in a pretty literal way.
It's a personal story on their part. So all of these people that we spoke to have tons of sketchbooks and draw prolifically and have things that they've done in their hands. So we worked with them and actually had them illustrate things specifically for this and tried to kind of imbue each episode with a sense of their own creative point of view and literally in their hand as much as we could.
And like you mentioned, music plays such a big part in this one. Was that something that you discovered in like initial conversations with him, or was that something that gradually you discovered that these stories and these ideas are kind of coming back to music, and maybe that's something we can literally show in the context of the rest of the episode?
I think as soon as they heard that he was a accordion virtuoso at the age of 6, just felt like, well, he should be playing the accordion, looking at the World Trade Center at the end of the film. He didn't want to play the accordion, unfortunately, but yeah, that's just kind of too strange, and you couldn't write that really, So that came out of his biography, and then a lot of the really interesting things are these sort of personal, slightly idiosyncratic, anecdotal type moments that we kind of expand into. Whether or not that really shaped his understanding of architecture, I'm not sure, but certainly works out well for us to imagine it did, Yeah.
Because that connects to the idea of appreciating art through an avenue that you're already familiar with. Like if I don't know this piece of fine art, if I don't know this piece of architecture, I can connect to it through the context of something that I do know. And so like putting, musical notes on a New York City skyline, that then helps you see it in a different way. And so I guess how did you land on how to show that visually? Because I imagine there are different forms that could have taken of actually putting sheet music over giant New York buildings.
Well, I feel like most creative processes, especially those having to do with visual arts, all have a certain kind of similar structure, I think, and you can kind of interchange them when you talk about, the first light bulb of an idea that you have, or the first melody that you think of, or the first doodle that you make, and or when you're influenced by something that happens in your life, or something that you've seen, or a piece of work, and you walk around through your daily life, and the lens through which you see the world changes slightly, and you might perceive the world, more as a series of musical notation, for instance. So it's just, again, a metaphor to kind of show that when you get really obsessed around thinking about a certain process or a project, you are sort of filtering the world through that lens, and it's something that we did in different ways through the different episodes.
It also came out of, I think, one of the early pre-interviews we did with Daniel. He talks a lot about the work he does, like he's scoring for a symphony. He even says it, I think, in the film. And so I think that was something that we kind of grabbed onto and started to figure out, okay, creatively, like, how do we express that idea? And when it went through a bunch of iterations of that thought, but it was really like born out of his own language. Like, he thinks of himself as a conductor in a lot of ways.
He sort of has to do that I feel like what I was fishing for in talking to him was how I lived in New York during this whole time, and I remember when he was slowly kind of erased from the creative process of the Freedom Tower, and I just remember feeling like, how could you not carry that resentment with you? And so I always thought it was kind of a rationalization that he was saying, well, the master planner is the conductor of the symphony, and I was I kind of wanted to say, well, what about the composer of the music, and I kind of wanted him to fess up to having some embittered feelings about it, but he never did, and part of me cynically thought, well, that's part of his, public outward facing strategy to remain affable and not ruffle feathers, but actually I think when you see the film, like, his strategy of optimism in terms of just dealing with his life is so deep set that I feel like he genuinely thinks that he's genuinely fine with the way things turned out. I mean, obviously, he got to build this museum afterwards too, so it worked out okay for him. But I think, but no, I think that's really deeply set in him, and I don't.
But there's also that ending where you see it again, where there's two sides of the coin, right? There's the pessimistic story and the optimistic story, and he chooses to believe the optimistic, but there's a wistfulness that he's aware that he's making a choice, and there's sadness embedded in that, right? So it's
yeah, absolutely, yeah, that's a good point.
You mentioned the pre-interview process and the fact that this is a sort of a 5-year journey. I feel like one of the central projects in any documentary project is actually developing that sense of trust with your subject and actually convincing them that you are the person who can tell their story in the best way possible. And so I guess this is a series where you're having to do that multiple times, but in Daniel's case, since that's the episode we just saw, what were some of the things that you did to sort of let him know that you would be telling his story in a way that would sort of honor his creations and not sort of push around the edges, I guess?
I think I just told him the things that I mentioned earlier that really I found inspiring too. I told him, that I came from a place of I guess, being somebody who is creative for a profession, I've kind of run up against moments where inspiration is hard to come by, and all of the circumstances seem to conspire against you, and I've had a lot of no's, and I've had a lot of projects dissolve, and things that anybody who ever does anything creative for a living comes up against. And so he kind of understood that I had kind of experienced some of what he had. And I also told him, when we first started talking about the series, I imagined, like, sometimes I'll have a work deadline and I'll feel like that there's a lot of pressure on me, but I just couldn't imagine feeling the pressure of all of, well, the world, but certainly everybody who lived in New York City, and then all the families of the victims, and just everybody, like, all of those forces, the forces of all of their expectations and hopes and dreams are kind of bearing down on your shoulders as you're trying to figure out how to solve creative problems. Seemed like, made my creative problems seem pale by comparison. But anyway, just sharing the kind of like-mindedness that I think, and then how charming and inspiring I felt like his story was.
A lot of it too is like about just the intention for the series, and the idea is like to inspire a generation of young creative people to kind of think a little bit differently about the obstacles they're up against. Like to Patrick's point, in a process or in a project, or they have a client that sucks, or they have an issue with a collaborator that they can't handle. But to be able to see that people like Daniel, have to struggle through that same stuff and fight through it. And as soon as you started to explain to these folks like Daniel that was really the intention behind the series, they saw the opportunity to kind of tell a story that might have touched young people in a way that they wish something might have touched them when they were younger, or taught them a lesson about the process. And that was, I think, a pretty big unlock as we were engaging Daniel or anybody about the rest of the episodes.
Yeah, I think the thing that I saw when I watched it again this time was the role of collaboration, which I hadn't really thought about as much, and like that's so critical to bigger creative projects. Like filmmaking is super collaborative. Projects like that is collaborative. There's a lot of work you can do by yourself in a room or on TikTok, or you can make stuff. It's easy to make stuff alone, but when you get into these bigger projects, so much of it is about the human interactions and communication, and convincing them that you know what you're doing. That part of it is so important to learn and understand how it works. And this is like a great snapshot into that. And I think all the ones that we made are about that. So I'm glad that's coming across.
And not just the idea of collaboration, but the tools matter too, which from an Adobe standpoint, I'm sure that means a lot.
Yeah, it's ironic that we have nothing digital in this entire film. But that was kind of intentional in a way. To that point, we're not. This isn't exactly branded content. This is a documentary about creativity, and I think and the creative process, and we're supporting that part of it more so.
Yeah, in none of the films in the series, is there any Photoshop, no mention of InDesign? That's not what this is.
I tried to get Patrick to work that in, and he just kept saying, said no.
Well, I wanted a free subscription, but I
couldn't do it.
We'll have some time for some audience questions. We've got a couple more before we get to that point. I don't know that I've ever seen a recreation in a documentary structured quite like this, to actually have the person present observing that in front of them. At what point in the process did that idea come up, and was that something that you had to sort of address with him? And because I imagine it's a surreal feeling to have your life play out in front of you like that. Yeah,
he actually loved it in the end. Well, he's loquacious, so I had a lot of chats with him about. It was very evocative the way he would talk about his life in this apartment in the Bronx and what his daily life was like, and how kind of vociferous all his different family members were and their dynamic, and it just felt like it'd be great to have him orchestrate that and talk to us about how it worked. His parents were a huge influence in his life, and it seemed like they had all sort of survived this and escaped this sort of trauma of post-war Europe together. And when I told him about it, he was up for it. He loved it, and then actually doing it. It really turned out much better than I thought it would, to be honest. But because we just cast some actors, and we had to sort of talk about who they were supposed to be, and they did a fantastic job. And he just placed them and told them what they should be talking about, and they just riffed, and it went really well.
One of the things about the process, though, of making this and all the other films, this shot was all shot during the heat of COVID, when all of the kind of the gnarliest COVID protocols were in place. So much of the shooting was done remotely. There was a lot of obstacles even just to getting it made, and so the idea of the recreation was even a challenge, because at that point, it was difficult to get actors on a set together. And get crew on a set with actors, and the testing process was tricky, and there was this risk of getting shut down. And we were shooting in New York, right, which has its own complexities if you've ever shot there. And so I think the fact that it turned out as well as it did is kind of a miracle, because at that point it was really a pretty big risk for us to try to make something like that, because there wasn't a lot of stuff being made at that particular moment with real life actors in a closed set like that.
But it's also so great because they're also centered around the same table that he draws on and learned his technique from, and it's just such a cool, like that little Formica table is such the center of his world, and it's interesting.
Yeah. And I love that there's a spirit of show don't tell throughout all this. That this is a participatory thing. It's not just.
That's why I'm here to tell.
Yeah. It's not just one man talking about his accomplishments. You actually see him sketching on this table. You actually see him walking through the museum that he helped design and create. And so I imagine that was also a conscious choice on your part to not just have someone sitting down in front of a camera telling their story, but to actually see them interact with what they made.
Yeah, I think we've done a lot of interviews, like talking heads, and that gets really, really old. And the way that Patrick sort of found a way to make those feel fresh was part of that's one thing we didn't want to do. And so that's one thing he did was keep it fresh. And both Daniel's interview in black and white and all the other ones just felt very organic and right for the piece, I think. So that was one thing.
And something I didn't really notice until I saw it up on this big full screen is that in those in the one interview in front of the museum in Berlin, the camera is kind of always moving back and forth. It's not just a static thing. Like it's subtle, but there's movement to it. There's momentum. It's not just someone planting and telling their story.
Yeah, that was the height of COVID, and I was remote in that, and I was. Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, I want to take credit for that. So that was that was exactly what I had in mind.
There you go. Yeah.
Well, I think it all the drawing and stuff it's a little bit the approach of like sometimes you meet a family member who doesn't know what you do that much at Thanksgiving, and they want to sit you down at the table and ask you like, oh, why'd you draw that line instead of that line? Like, why is it diagonal? Why does it look like that? Why? And so I don't know. It was interesting to think about how to unpack somebody's creative process down to these details and kind of understand. And he was at first kind of like, I guess I don't know why. I guess maybe that's why I do it that way. And it's interesting to kind of ask of ourselves like why we do things the way we do as it's shaped by our past experiences.
Fantastic. Well, I'm sure we have some folks out there who are curious about this process and everything. Let's start with you in the white.
I'm wondering who the other artists will be in the series, and what was the collaborative process in selecting those?
I'll speak to maybe who the other episodes are about. So the second episode is about a designer named Lance Wyman, who created the really iconic logo and design system for the 1968 Mexico City Olympics. That's the one. It's the kind of the concentric circles that come off the 6-8, and the Olympic rings are sort of built inside of it. And what's so extraordinary about that story is Lance is this young designer from New York City. He's never been to Mexico before, and he gets a phone call from the Olympic Committee in Mexico. Can he come down and design a logo? And as he's down there in that process, the student uprising happens, and there are suddenly tanks rolling through the street, and there's a massacre in the square. And the students who are sort of leading this revolution, they actually co-opt all of his design for the Olympics, and they kind of turn it on its ear and kind of point it back to the government as their own sort of form of propaganda. So it's a really interesting story about like ownership and authorship. And from his perspective, he's in his late 80s now. Like looking back on that experience was incredible. And then the other episode is about a data visualization artist at Pentagram. Her name is Georgia Lupi. And she takes these giant data sets and creates these beautiful works of art out of them. And during COVID, she went through a really bad breakup. And in kind of the depths of her despair, she had this thought, what if I could actually kind of harness my creative energy and go on a bit of a journey myself and figure out if I could find love. And what if I could actually capture all that data around my search for love and visualize it and create art out of it? So she creates these amazing pieces of art all about her search for love during COVID. It's called Love in the Time of COVID. So that's the third episode. There's ambition for us to make others beyond it. There's no shortage of stories kind of centered around amazing creative processes. But those are the next ones that are kind of on deck. And then in terms of the collaborative process, really it was us just kind of coming up with a list working internally, working with Dan and the team at Adobe to kind of make sure that the folks we wanted to reach out to just made sense. But particularly, like, we chose these three because at the time we came up with this idea 5 years ago, the 20th anniversary of 9/11 was on the horizon. So the idea was to shoot the Daniel episode, and then that same year you had the Olympics that were supposed to happen in Tokyo, so the 68 Olympic story made sense. All that sort of went out the window when COVID happened, and we quickly kind of pivoted and found George's story and shot that. But they were really intentionally chosen around those like specific moments. So now we're sort of rethinking a little bit the approach as we move forward and shoot the others.
Yeah, and there was a time where these three lined up perfectly with releasing into the world 3 years ago.
So just imagine COVID hadn't happened. It would have been incredible. I mean, I'm sure your lives would probably have been affected too.
But I mean, we're in a fundamentally different world of how people take in stories like this, and so as you think about where these stories will live, I'm guessing that calculus changes too.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things we talk about a lot is if we did this today, we might. I love this series exactly, and this was exactly what we wanted to do at the time, and our audience, our creative audience, will resonate with this and love this. But you know, like audiences and strategy changes at Adobe, like quarter to quarter, not year to year, and so we might not make exactly the same thing now. We might, if we did this, it might be a different group of people, or we might do some kind of different storytelling. It's a little bit weird. That's one of the things about brands being in this streaming space. Like when they're quarter to quarter driven, and this stuff takes longer than that, kind of aligning strategies can be hard.
Just to be clear, like the way this all came together, it wasn't like we came up with the idea for Full Bleed in a vacuum and then went and pitched it to Adobe just as like a sponsor. Like it worked the other way. Like they had an intention of wanting to be in the space and to tell longer form stories that champion creativity. It was almost like the creative brief to us. We came up with the idea for Full Bleed with Patrick, built out the stories, and then together sort of made the whole thing happen. A lot of people think that it's just as simple as we come up with ideas and then just go find brands to write us checks. Like, it's not the case. It's actually the other way around.
I think we had, yes, in the front row in the orange. Yes.
I was curious about your process interviewing Daniel. How many times did you speak with him? How many times on camera? How much time in between? And how did you use that time in between to recalibrate?
Well, first we have just a kind of towing the water conversation, seeing if it's something he's interested in. That was happening on Zoom by the time this thing actually started to get real. And he seemed open, he seemed interested, and then we did a proper pre-interview, which is kind of a loose conversation that lasts about 45 minutes or an hour, where we have done a bunch of research on our end. We have a sense of what the main aspects of the story we want to tell are, and we're going to kind of see how he tells them in his words, see how he responds to them, what are the boundaries that he's gonna, where is he not gonna go with it, where is he gonna go with it, and again, sort of trying to save the best stuff for when we're actually shooting him still. And then, using that, we basically construct what we think will be a timeline for the whole episode, and remaining open to whatever else he might come up with, on the day. And I think we had probably he was in Berlin, so we scrambled to get a team out to shoot him remotely, and that was the first real interview. And then we did a couple more in New York, probably a month later or something. So we'd had a little bit of time to adjust, but I'd had a couple of casual conversations, and by then I was getting very comfortable kind of hanging out and chatting with him. He's a very interesting guy. So the story about his name originally being David, and then the bureaucrat at the ministry in Poland deciding that, telling his father that he wasn't allowed to name him that just came up over coffee, and I asked him about it while we were looking at the sunset over New York. So some of this stuff just comes up in conversation, and it's good if you have the luxury of access to the subjects to kind of just let them talk and get to know them. Because on our shooting days it wasn't just roll the camera and let them go. And you know, we had very specific things that we needed to, some kind of quasi recreation things where he's walking around in certain shots and stuff like that. So we couldn't just let him just sort of run, you know, uninterrupted.
Yes, we've got right here. Over here.
Sure. So, two-part question. First one's easy. Where can we watch the rest of these?
So, good question. So we're actually, let's say we're in negotiations with a streaming platform to house the 3 films, and then hopefully help us make a few more. But the intention's always been, like, let's try to find the widest audience for these things as possible. Obviously, the market's changed, right? And so we've had to, again, like, sort of pivot and change our thinking a little bit there. But the intention, yeah, is that it'll be out in the world hopefully soon on a streamer.
I look forward to it, to watching them. Excellent job, by the way, with everything. Then the question I wanted to really ask was, what was it like? Obviously, everyone, you know, sitting up here is a creative. You're working with an extreme creative and an architect who's done extraordinary things. What was the process like achieving your vision and meshing that with his? And did he have some input along the way into terms of how everything was laid out visually? And you know, was he happy with the end result of how you portrayed his process and how everything came together?
He was happy in the end. He sent me a text at the end after having seen it, and he was like, you know, thank you, you brought it across. You know, he was really happy with the way we portrayed it. That said, he never had a real authorial hand in what we were going to say and what we weren't going to say, and that's sort of our prerogative to have retained some kind of documentary independence, because as I shared with you a moment ago, like, I wasn't totally sure that he didn't harbor resentment, even though he wouldn't, you know, say, and I started to sense that there was only so far I could sort of push that line of questioning without being maybe upsetting them a little bit, or kind of, why are you wanting to dig up that stuff? So, you know, I was just kind of feeling it out as we went along about what were the things that they wanted to portray and what weren't. But his office was really cooperative, and you know, I wanted materials of his that he had drawn to reference in some of the archival moments, and I wanted to use some of his drawings to build animations off of, and they were really forthcoming with all that. I mean, he doesn't have the time to sort of give me days and days of, you know, drawing, you know, bespoke drawings for the film, but you know, within whatever he could do, he was super cooperative and super collaborative.
Oh, you know, also on the collaborative amongst us, especially being on the brand side, like we basically commissioned Patrick to make these films, and we trusted his vision, and we chose him for a reason, but we would still talk to him and have input and have ideas and float ideas. I think we tried to have a super light touch, and I think we also tried to have a super light touch in terms of like protecting the brand and caring about the brand, which I think we did in the end. I mean, a couple of things you probably would like to still have in there that aren't in there, maybe, I don't know. But generally it's good to have a single point of leadership and creativity, I think, even when you're collaborating, and we kind of entrusted that to Patrick.
It all goes back to collaboration. It all goes back to collaboration. Thank you, the three of you, for being here. Dan, Zach, Patrick, really appreciate it. And enjoy the rest of your day here at SeriesFest.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for having us.